no one would buy the obese girl, abandoned without clothes at the auction, until the mountain man did. The auction block stood in the center of Redemption Falls like a monument to human cruelty. Weathered wood, stained dark from years of rain and the sweat of desperate people. Elara stood upon it now, trembling in the harsh noon sun, wearing nothing but a thin cotton shift that did little to preserve her modesty or dignity. Her stepfather, Marcus Crane, had stripped her of her dress that morning, claiming it was too valuable to waste on someone being sold for debts. The shift clung to her large frame, emphasizing every curve and roll, making her substantial size impossible to ignore. Around the platform, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the spectacle like vultures to carrion. Their faces showed a mixture of disgust, pity, and cruel amusement as they assessed her. At 23, Elara had lived her entire life being judged for her size, but this was beyond anything she had endured before. This was public humiliation designed to break her spirit completely. Marcus stood beside the auctioneer, a weasel-faced man named Silas, who specialized in selling off the property of the desperate and destitute. Her stepfather's face showed no remorse, only the calculating expression of a man determined to extract value from a situation he considered unfortunate. He had married Elara's mother 5 years ago, shortly before consumption took her life. Since then, he had made it clear that Elara was a burden he never wanted, one he tolerated only because her mother's property came with the marriage. "Gentlemen," Silas called out, his voice carrying across the square, "we have here a girl in need of placement, strong enough for heavy work, as you can plainly see. Any man willing to take her gets the labor she can provide. We'll start the bidding at $50. Silence greeted his announcement. Men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Elara. Women whispered behind fans, their judgment as heavy as the desert heat. $50 was a substantial sum, but more than that, no one wanted to be associated with purchasing the fat girl on the auction block. Elara closed her eyes, willing herself to disappear, to wake from this nightmare. But when she opened them, she was still there, still exposed to hundreds of mocking stares. Tears burned behind her eyelids, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. $40 then, Silas continued, his voice growing more desperate. Surely someone can use an extra pair of hands. More silence. Someone in the crowd laughed, a harsh bark that others quickly joined. "You'd have to pay us to take her," a man called out, and the crowd roared with cruel laughter. Elara's face burned with shame. Her hands moved instinctively to cover herself, though the gesture was futile. She wanted to run, but Marcus stood guard at the platform's edge, ensuring she could not escape this final humiliation. $20, Silas tried again, sweat beading on his forehead. 10? Come now. Someone must need help with chores. The laughter grew louder, crueler. Women turned away in mock disgust, while men made lewd comments about what they would and would not do with someone of Elara's size. Each word was a knife cutting deeper into what remained of her dignity. Then a voice rang out from the back of the crowd, deep and commanding enough to silence the mockery. "I'll give you $1 silver." Every head turned. The crowd parted reluctantly to reveal a tall figure standing in the shadow of the mercantile building. As he stepped into the sunlight, gasps rippled through the assembly. The man was unlike anyone Elara had seen in town before, powerfully built, with broad shoulders and muscled arms visible beneath his rolled sleeves. His chest was defined even through his shirt, speaking of a life spent in hard physical labor. Dark hair fell past his collar, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. But what struck Alara most were his eyes gray as storm clouds, and filled with an anger that made several people take an involuntary step back. $1? Silas sputtered, clearly offended by the insult. Sir, this is hardly— It's $1 more than anyone else is offering, the stranger interrupted, his voice like gravel. And it's all she's worth to me. Take it or send her back to wherever she came from, but make your decision now. I have business to attend to. Marcus pushed forward, his face red with indignation and greed warring for dominance. $1 is an insult. This girl can work. She can stand here and be humiliated further while you try to squeeze more money from people who clearly want no part of this spectacle, the stranger said coldly. Or you can take my dollar and we can all move on with our lives. Your choice, but decide quickly. The two men stared at each other, wills clashing visibly. Finally, Marcus snatched the silver dollar from the stranger's outstretched hand. Fine, take her. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway. The stranger Cale, though Alara would not learn his name until later, removed his heavy coat and climbed onto the platform before anyone could react. He wrapped the coat around Alara's shoulders with surprising gentleness, his large hands careful not to touch her skin. The coat was enormous on her, but it covered her completely, shielding her from the crowd's stares. Come, he said quietly, offering his hand. Let's get you away from these vultures. Alara took his hand with trembling fingers, too shocked to speak. He helped her down from the platform, his grip steady and sure, then kept himself positioned between her and the crowd as they walked toward a wagon at the edge of the square. People moved aside, some still laughing, others looking vaguely ashamed of what they had witnessed. As Cale helped Alara into the wagon seat, Marcus called out one last time, Don't come crying to me when you realize what a burden she is. I wash my hands of her. Kyle turned slowly, his expression so dangerous that Marcus actually took a step backward. The only burden I see, Kyle said in a voice that carried to every corner of the square, is the moral failing of a town that would allow such cruelty. You should all be ashamed. He climbed into the wagon beside Alara, gathered the reins, and urged the horses forward without another word. As they rolled out of Redemption Falls, Alara sat rigid with shock, clutching his coat around her shoulders, unable to process what had just happened. Behind them, the crowd slowly dispersed, already moving on to the next entertainment, the next scandal. They rode in heavy silence for nearly an hour, the trail climbing steadily into the foothills. Alara kept her head down, mortification washing over her in waves as the shock began to wear off. She had been sold, displayed like livestock, and sold for $1 to a stranger. And now she was being taken God knew where, completely at this man's mercy. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Where are you taking me? To my cabin, Kyle said, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. It's about 3 hours from here, up in the high country, remote but safe. Why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Why did you buy me? What do you want from me? Kyle was quiet for a long moment, guiding the horses around a switchback. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. I didn't buy you. I bought your freedom from that situation. What I want is for you to never have to stand on that auction block again, never have to endure that kind of humiliation. As for what happens next, that's up to you." Elara stared at him, searching his profile for the lie, the hidden agenda. Men did not simply rescue women from auctions without expecting something in return. "I don't understand." "You don't have to," Kyle said. "Not yet. Just know that I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm not expecting anything from you that you're not willing to give. When we get to the cabin, you'll have your own space, your own privacy. We'll figure out the rest as we go." His words were similar to what other men might say as a prelude to betrayal, but something in his tone made Elara want to believe him. Or perhaps it was simply that she had no choice. Running would mean certain death in these mountains, and returning to Marcus was unthinkable. She had to trust this stranger, at least for now. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they climbed into country Elara had never imagined. Dense pine forests gave way to alpine meadows filled with wild flowers. Crystal streams rushed alongside the trail, and in the distance, snow-capped peaks touched the sky. Despite her exhaustion and emotional turmoil, Elara found herself captivated by the raw beauty of the landscape. "It's beautiful," she murmured, more to herself than to Kyle. "It is," he agreed. "That's why I came here 7 years ago and stayed. Too much ugliness in the world below. Up here, things are simpler, harder, but cleaner somehow." As twilight deepened, they finally arrived at Kyle's cabin. It was solidly built of logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A barn stood nearby, and Elara could hear animals moving inside. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work, the homestead of someone committed to making a life in this isolated place. Kyle helped Elara down from the wagon, then led her inside while he lit lanterns. The interior was Spartan, but clean: a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was orderly in the way of a man long accustomed to living alone. "The room on the right is mine," Kyle said, gesturing. "The one on the left is yours now. There's a bed, a chest for your things when you get some, and a wash basin. The necessary is out back. I'll heat water so you can wash, and I'll find something more suitable for you to wear than that shift." He disappeared into his room and returned with a large homespun shirt and a pair of trousers with rope for a belt. "These will be huge on you, but they're better than what you have. I'll see about getting you proper clothes next time I go to town." Elara took the clothes with numb fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Kyle said, though not unkindly. "Mountain life is hard. You'll earn your keep if you choose to stay, but tonight, just rest. We can talk about everything else tomorrow." In the privacy of the small bedroom, Elara finally allowed herself to collapse. She washed as best she could in the basin of warm water Kale provided, then dressed in his oversized clothes. They swam on her frame, but they were clean and covered her completely, which was all that mattered. She crawled into the narrow bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt something approaching safety. Sleep came hard, haunted by the faces of the mocking crowd and the memory of standing nearly naked on that auction block. But when nightmares woke her in the darkest hours, she heard Kale moving quietly in the main room, tending the fire, and somehow his presence was comforting rather than threatening. Morning arrived with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Elara emerged from her room cautiously to find Cale preparing breakfast with efficient movements. He glanced at her, nodded a greeting, and gestured to the table. "Sit. Food's almost ready." They ate in silence, Elara still too overwhelmed to make conversation. After breakfast, Kyle showed her around the homestead, explaining the daily routines: feeding the chickens, milking the cow, tending the vegetable garden, maintaining the cabin. It was clear he was offering her a role, a way to contribute and feel useful. "I can't pay you wages," he said bluntly, "but you'll have shelter, food, safety, and privacy. In exchange, I'm hoping you'll help with the work. Fair?" Elara nodded slowly. It was more than fair. It was generous beyond anything she had hoped for. "I'll do my best," she promised. "I'm not used to this kind of work, but I'll learn." "That's all I ask," Kyle said. "And Elara, one more thing. What happened yesterday in that town, don't let it define you. Those people are small and cruel because their own lives are empty. You're better than their judgment." Tears filled Elara's eyes at the unexpected kindness. No one had spoken to her with such respect in years. She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and Cale mercifully changed the subject to the practical matters of chicken care. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that gradually became familiar. Elara learned to manage the chickens in the vegetable garden, discovering that she had a natural aptitude for growing things. The physical work was demanding, and she tired easily at first, but her body slowly adapted to the altitude and exertion. More importantly, the work gave her purpose and dignity. She was contributing, being useful, proving her worth through action rather than suffering judgment based on appearance. Kyle proved to be an easy companion. He was quiet by nature, often going hours without speaking, but his silence was companionable rather than hostile. He never criticized her mistakes or made her feel inadequate when she struggled with unfamiliar tasks. Instead, he taught her patiently, demonstrating techniques and then stepping back to let her practice. Evenings became Elara's favorite time. After the work was done and dinner was eaten, they would sit by the fire. Cale often read aloud from the small collection of books he kept: adventure stories, poetry, even philosophical essays. Elara discovered he was far more educated than his rough exterior suggested, and she found herself looking forward to these evening readings with growing anticipation. One night, about 6 weeks after her arrival, Elara gathered her courage to share something precious. She retrieved the Bible her mother had left her, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep from Marcus's greedy hands. "My mother used to read to me from this," she said softly. Would you like me to read some passages? I know you've been doing all the reading." Kyle's face softened with something like pleasure. "I'd like that very much." So Elara read, her voice gaining strength as she moved through familiar verses her mother had loved. When she finished, Kyle was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother taught you well," he said finally. "You read beautifully." The simple compliment warmed Elara more than the fire. She was beginning to realize that Cale saw her, truly saw her in a way no one else ever had. He did not see her size first and her person second. He saw her actions, her efforts, her growing competence, and he valued those things. As autumn painted the mountains in gold and scarlet, Elara found herself transforming in ways both physical and emotional. The constant work had changed her body, building muscle beneath the softness, giving her strength she had never known she possessed. More than that, the steady routine and adequate food had brought color to her cheeks and brightness to her eyes. She still carried substantial weight, but she moved with more confidence now, no longer hunching to make herself smaller. The cabin, too, had transformed under her care. Curtains now hung in the windows, made from fabric Coyle had brought from town. Wild flowers brightened the table. The garden flourished under her attention, providing abundant vegetables that she learned to preserve for winter. The harsh bachelor dwelling was becoming a true home, warm and welcoming. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Kyle spoke more than usual. "I should tell you something about why I live up here alone," he said, staring into the flames. "Why I haven't been to town in 7 years except for absolutely necessary supplies." Elara waited, sensing this was important. "I was engaged once back in Missouri, a woman named Sarah. She was beautiful, educated, from a good family. Everyone said we were a perfect match." His voice was heavy with old pain. "But when she found out I had no head for business, that I preferred working with my hands to running a store or managing accounts, she called off the engagement. Said she couldn't marry someone so common, so beneath her expectations." He paused, jaw clenching. What hurt wasn't losing her. I realized later we weren't suited. What hurt was learning that my worth in her eyes, in society's eyes, was based entirely on my ability to fit into boxes I was never meant to occupy. So I came west, found this place, and decided I'd rather be judged by mountains and trees than by people who can't see past their own narrow definitions of value. Elara absorbed his story, recognizing the echoes of her own experience. "I understand," she said quietly. "Being judged for things you can't control, for not fitting someone else's idea of what you should be." "Exactly," Cale said, meeting her eyes. "That's why what happened at that auction made me so angry. Those people were doing to you what Sarah and her society friends did to me, reducing you to a single characteristic and deciding that defined your worth. It was wrong then, and it was wrong in that square." "Thank you," Elara said, the words encompassing more than just his explanation, "for seeing me as more than what they saw." "It's not hard," Cale said simply. "You are more. Anyone with eyes could see that, if they bothered to look past their own prejudices." Winter arrived with early snows, transforming the valley into a wonderland of white. Cale had prepared well, with the cabin snug and the stores plentiful. The cold drove them indoors for longer periods, and their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Elara learned about Cale's childhood, his years of wandering before finding this place. She shared memories of her mother, of the happy years before Marcus entered their lives. They were sitting by the fire on a bitter January evening when Cale suddenly tensed, his head cocked toward the door. "Riders," he said quietly, rising to his feet. "3 of them, from the sound of it." Elara's heart seized with fear. Who would come to this remote cabin in the dead of winter? Before she could voice the question, heavy fists pounded on the door. Cale gestured for Elara to stay back, then opened it carefully, revealing Marcus Crane flanked by 2 well-dressed men Elara did not recognize. "Well, well," Marcus said with a smarmy smile. "Found you at last, Elara. Took some tracking, but here you are, living in sin with your mountain man." "What do you want, Crane?" Coyle asked, his voice cold as the winter wind. One of the other men stepped forward, pulling documents from his coat. My name is Theodore Blackwell, attorney for the Western Railroad Company. We're here regarding a water rights claim that rightfully belongs to Miss Crane." "It's Mrs. Thornton, actually," Marcus corrected with false sweetness. "Elara's mother, my late wife, held rights to a valuable spring that feeds into the river valley below. Rights she left to Elara in her will. The railroad needs access to that water for a planned line through the territory, and we're prepared to pay handsomely for it." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She had known her mother owned land, but she had never heard anything about water rights. Marcus had never mentioned them, had acted as though her mother left nothing of value. "As her legal guardian until she marries," Marcus continued, "I have the authority to negotiate on her behalf. The railroad is offering $5,000 for those rights, of which I'll take my proper share as her guardian. But first, we need to convince Elara to come back to town and sign the necessary papers." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Elara said, finding her voice. "And you're not my guardian. I'm 23 years old, well past the age of majority." Marcus's smile turned ugly. "You're also unmarried, and, according to law, subject to male oversight. Since your mountain man here hasn't made an honest woman of you, I'm still your legal guardian. And I say you're coming back to sign those papers." "She's not going anywhere," Cale said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "And if those water rights belong to her, she has the right to decide what happens to them without your interference." "The law says differently," Theodore Blackwell interjected smoothly. "I have the documentation right here. Without a husband to represent her interests, Miss Thornton falls under her stepfather's guardianship. It's unfortunate, perhaps, but quite legal." Elara looked desperately at Cale, who was clearly calculating options. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "We'll return in 3 days," Blackwell said. "That gives Miss Thornton time to consider her options and prepare for the journey back to town. I strongly suggest you cooperate. The railroad can be very persuasive when necessary, and we would hate for this to become unpleasant." The threat was thinly veiled. After they left, Elara collapsed into a chair, trembling. "They're going to take everything," she whispered. "The water rights, the money, everything my mother meant for me to have." Kyle paced like a caged wolf, thinking hard. "Not if we act first," he said finally. "Elara, if you were married, Marcus would have no claim on you or your property. Your husband would be your legal representative." Elara's heart stuttered. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting we get married," Coyle said bluntly. "Not for romance or convention, but as a legal strategy. If we present ourselves as husband and wife, Marcus and his railroad friends lose their leverage. You can decide what to do with your water rights without his interference." "But that would tie you to me," Elara protested. "You'd be stuck with a partner who's transformed my cabin into a home," Coyle interrupted. "With someone I've come to respect and value. Elara, this isn't a sacrifice for me. Over these months, you've become important to me. I'd be honored to call you my wife, legal strategy or not." Tears spilled down Elara's cheeks, but these were different tears than she had cried on the auction block. "You really mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean," Kyle replied. "So what do you say? Will you marry me, Elara Thornton?" "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, I will." The following morning, Cale saddled 2 horses, and they rode through the bitter cold to the nearest settlement with a preacher. The ceremony was simple, conducted in the preacher's drafty cabin with his wife as witness. But when Kyle slipped a simple gold band onto Ilara's finger, she felt something shift in her chest. This marriage might have begun as a legal maneuver, but looking into Cale's steady gray eyes, she recognized something real growing between them, something that might, given time, become love. When Marcus and the railroad men returned 3 days later, they found Cale and Ilara waiting on the cabin porch, marriage certificate in hand. Marcus's face turned apoplectic when he saw the document, properly witnessed and registered. "This is fraud," he sputtered, "a marriage of convenience to cheat me of my rights." "Your rights?" Ilara said, her voice ringing with new confidence. "You have no rights to anything that was my mother's. This marriage may have been expedient, but it's legal. I'm Mrs. Cale Montgomery now, and my husband and I will decide what happens with our property." Theodore Blackwell studied the certificate carefully, his expression sour. "The marriage appears legitimate," he admitted. "Mrs. Montgomery, the railroad's offer still stands. $5,000 is an excellent price for water rights in this territory." "I'm sure it is," Ilara said, "but I'm not interested in selling. That water was precious to my mother, and it will be precious to me and my children should we have them. Find your water elsewhere." "You're making a mistake," Blackwell warned. "The railroad will have that route one way or another. It would be better for you to profit from the inevitable." "The only inevitable thing I see is you gentlemen leaving my property," Kyle said, his hand moving meaningfully toward the rifle leaning against the porch post. "My wife has spoken. The water rights are not for sale. Now get off our land." For a moment, it seemed like Marcus might argue further, but something in Cale's expression convinced him otherwise. The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away, Marcus shooting poisonous looks back over his shoulder. When they were gone, Ilara sagged against Kyle, suddenly exhausted. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her. "You were magnificent," he said softly, "standing up to them like that." "I was terrified," Ilara admitted, "but I was also angry. My mother wanted me to have those rights, wanted me to have security. I wasn't going to let Marcus steal that from me the way he's stolen everything else." "He won't," Cale promised. "I'll make sure of it." But Marcus was not done. 2 weeks later, papers arrived via courier, a lawsuit claiming fraud in the marriage and demanding that Ilara be returned to her guardian's oversight. The case was to be heard before the territorial judge in the county seat, a 2-day ride from the cabin. "They're not going to let this go," Ilara said, reading the summons with growing dread. "Marcus has clearly convinced the railroad to fund legal action. They have resources we can't match." "We have something better than resources," Cale said firmly. "We have the truth, and we have a legal marriage that no judge can simply annul because it's inconvenient for the railroad. We'll go, we'll present our case, and we'll win." The journey to the county seat was difficult, the roads still heavy with winter snow. When they arrived, Ilara was shocked to find that the case had attracted significant attention. The courthouse was packed with spectators, drawn by the drama of a fat girl fighting her stepfather and the powerful railroad company. The proceedings were presided over by Judge Cornelius Wheeler, a stern man in his 70s, with a reputation for fairness and intolerance for legal chicanery. Marcus and his lawyers presented their case first, arguing that the marriage was a transparent fraud designed to cheat Marcus of his guardianship rights and to block the railroad's legitimate business interests. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Theodore Blackwell argued, This marriage is clearly unconsummated. Look at Mr. Montgomery, a fit, attractive man in the prime of life, and then look at Mrs. Montgomery." He gestured dismissively toward Elara. "No reasonable person would believe that such a man would willingly marry such a woman, except as a legal stratagem. The marriage is a sham and should be annulled." Elara felt the familiar burn of humiliation, the sting of being judged solely by her appearance. She looked down at her hands, fighting tears, but then felt Cale's hand cover hers, warm and strong. Judge Wheeler's expression had darkened during Blackwell's speech. "Counselor," he said coldly, "in my courtroom we do not demean people based on their physical appearance. Your comment was inappropriate and irrelevant. Strike it from the record." He turned to Cale. "Mr. Montgomery, would you care to respond to these allegations?" Cale stood, his presence commanding even in the formal setting of the courtroom. "Your Honor, my marriage to Elara is legal and binding. We were married by Reverend Thomas in Pinewood Settlement, properly witnessed and recorded. As to whether it's genuine, that's not for Mr. Blackwell or anyone else to judge, based on whether we meet their standards of what a couple should look like." He paused, then continued with quiet intensity. "I married Elara because, in the months she's lived at my homestead, she's proven herself to be hard-working, intelligent, resourceful, and kind. She's transformed my cabin from a bachelor's shack into a real home. She's my partner in every sense of the word. If Blackwell can't fathom why I would choose her, that says more about his limited imagination than about the validity of our marriage." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Wheeler leaned forward. "Mrs. Montgomery, do you wish to add anything?" Elara stood on shaking legs, acutely aware of every eye on her. In that moment, she could have retreated into silence, could have let Cale speak for her. But she thought of her mother, who had fought to leave her something of value. She thought of the girl on the auction block, stripped of dignity and hope, and she found her voice. "Your Honor, my stepfather claims he wants what's best for me, but he's the one who put me on an auction block wearing nothing but a shift. He's the one who sold me for $1 to a stranger. He didn't care what happened to me then, and he doesn't care now. The only thing he cares about is the money the railroad is offering for my water rights." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Kyle Montgomery gave me dignity when I had none. He gave me safety, purpose, and respect. He taught me that my worth wasn't determined by my size or by cruel people's judgments. Our marriage may have started as a practical arrangement, but it's become something real, and I'll be damned if I let my stepfather or the railroad take that away from me." The courtroom erupted in applause and gasps. Judge Wheeler banged his gavel for order, but there was approval in his eyes. When silence was restored, he spoke clearly and firmly. "I've heard enough. The marriage between Cale and Elara Montgomery is legal and valid. I see no evidence of fraud or coercion. Mr. Crane, your guardianship over your stepdaughter ended the moment she married. You have no legal standing to challenge her decisions regarding her property. Case dismissed." He looked directly at Theodore Blackwell. "And, Counselor, tell your railroad clients that water rights belong to the people who hold them, not to whoever wants them most. If they want Mrs. Montgomery's water, they'll have to negotiate with her and her husband as equals, not try to steal it through legal manipulations." Outside the courthouse, Elara and Cale stood in the winter sunlight, legally secure for the first time. Marcus stormed past them without a word, his face mottled with rage. The railroad men followed, already discussing alternative routes that would avoid the need for Elara's water rights. "We won," Elara said, still not quite believing it. "We did," Kyle confirmed, then surprised her by pulling her into his arms in a public embrace. "You were incredible in there. The way you spoke up, defended yourself, I was so proud of you." Elara wrapped her arms around him, no longer caring who saw or what they thought. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving me, for protecting me, for believing I was worth saving." Kyle pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Elara, I need to tell you something. This marriage started as a legal strategy, yes, but somewhere along the way, it became more for me. You became more. I love you, not despite who you are, but because of who you are. Will you stay married to me not because we have to, but because we want to?" Joy bloomed in Elara's chest, warm and overwhelming. "I love you too," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it, afraid you'd think I was just grateful or obligated. But it's real, Kyle. I want to build a life with you as your true wife in every way." He kissed her then in front of the courthouse and God and anyone who cared to watch. And for the first time since her mother's death, Elara felt completely at peace, completely whole. The journey back to their mountain cabin felt different now, lighter somehow. They talked and laughed, making plans for spring planting and discussing whether to expand the chicken coop. They spoke as true partners, as husband and wife, in fact, as well as law. When they finally arrived home, Kyle carried Elara across the threshold in a gesture both traditional and playful. She laughed, protesting that she was too heavy, but he shook his head. "You're exactly right," he said, setting her down gently in their home. That night, they came together as husband and wife for the first time, tender and awkward and beautiful. Elara's fears about her body, about not being enough, dissolved under Cale's patient touch and whispered assurances. He showed her with actions more than words that he found her beautiful, that he desired her exactly as she was. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Elara thought about the journey that had brought her here from the horror of the auction block to the security of her husband's embrace. She had been stripped of everything, reduced to nothing, in the eyes of cruel strangers. But from that lowest point, she had built something beautiful and true. "What are you thinking?" Kyle asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. "I'm thinking about transformation," Elara said softly. "How sometimes you have to be completely broken before you can rebuild yourself into something stronger. I hated what happened on that auction block, hated the humiliation and the cruelty. But if it hadn't happened, I never would have come here, never would have found you." "I'm glad you did," Kyle said simply. "Find me, I mean. You've given me something I didn't know I was missing, a partner, a home, a future. You've made me want more than just solitary survival in these mountains." "What do you want?" Elara asked. "I want what we're building together," Kyle said. "A real homestead, maybe children someday if we're blessed. I want to grow old with you, Elara. I want our story to be about everything that came after that terrible day, not defined by it." "Then that's what we'll do," Elara agreed, nestling closer to his warmth. "We'll build our future together." Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and the rush of snowmelt in the streams. Elara and Kyle worked side by side, expanding their garden and making improvements to the homestead. Word gradually spread through the territory about the woman who had stood up to the railroad and won, and neighbors who had previously kept their distance began stopping by with gifts of seeds or tools, acknowledging Elara and Cale as part of the community. One warm afternoon in May, as Elara worked in her garden, she felt a familiar flutter in her abdomen. Her hand went to her stomach, and she smiled with quiet joy. She had suspected for weeks, but now she was certain she was carrying Cale's child. That evening, she told him, watching his face transform with wonder and pride. He dropped to his knees beside her, pressing his ear to her still flat belly, as if he could hear the baby's heartbeat. "A child," he breathed. "Our child." "Are you happy?" Elara asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Kyle said, looking up at her with shining eyes. "You've given me everything, Elara, more than I ever dreamed of having." As summer painted the mountains green and gold, Elara thought often about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She remembered the girl on the auction block, broken and ashamed, certain her life was over. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that the worst day of her life would become the doorway to the best days, that the man who bought her for a single dollar would give her wealth beyond measure, safety, dignity, respect, love, and now a family of her own. But she could not go back, and perhaps that was for the best. That girl needed to walk through fire to become the woman Elara was now, strong, confident, capable of fighting for herself and what mattered to her. The auction block had been her crucible, and Cale had been her salvation. But ultimately, she had saved herself by choosing to see her worth even when the world insisted she had none. As autumn returned to the mountains, painting them in shades of amber and crimson, Elara's pregnancy became obvious. She moved more slowly now, her hands often resting on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick and turn. Cale was endlessly solicitous, fussing over her in ways that made her laugh even as she appreciated his care. One crisp October evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the peaks, wrapped in blankets against the cooling air. Elara leaned against Cale's solid warmth, feeling completely content. Their first year of marriage was drawing to a close, and it had been filled with challenges and triumphs, struggles and joys. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "That day in Redemption Falls? You could have walked away, kept your dollar and your solitary life." Kyle was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he turned to look at her, his gray eyes reflecting the fading light. "The only thing I regret," he said seriously, "is that I didn't have the courage to intervene sooner, before you had to stand on that block and endure such cruelty. But regret buying you? Regret bringing you here? Never, not for a single moment." He placed his hand over hers on her belly. "You've given me more than I ever gave you, Elara. You've given me purpose, partnership, love, and now a family. That dollar was the best investment I ever made." Elara smiled, leaning up to kiss him softly. "I think we're both richer for it," she said, "in all the ways that matter." As winter approached and the baby's arrival drew near, Cale made preparations with characteristic thoroughness. He rode to the nearest settlement and returned with a midwife named Sarah, a capable woman who agreed to stay at the cabin through Elara's confinement. He stocked the cabin with extra supplies and firewood, ensuring they could weather any storm that might come. Ilara's labor began on a cold December night, with snow falling softly outside the cabin windows. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following day, but when their son finally arrived, red-faced and squalling with healthy lungs, the pain was forgotten in the overwhelming rush of love. Kyle held his son with trembling hands, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered cheeks. "He's perfect," he breathed. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Daniel, after Ilara's father, who had died when she was young. Daniel Montgomery had his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination, evident even in infancy by the strength of his grip and the volume of his cries. As Ilara recovered from childbirth, Sarah the midwife proved invaluable, teaching her about nursing and caring for a newborn. But it was Cale who surprised everyone with his natural aptitude for fatherhood. He walked the floor with Daniel at all hours, sang to him in a surprisingly gentle voice, changed diapers without complaint, and looked at his son with such fierce love that it made Ilara's heart ache with happiness. Spring returned, as it always did in the mountains, bringing new life and new beginnings. Daniel grew strong and healthy, his laughter filling the cabin with joy. Ilara returned to her beloved garden with her son strapped to her back, teaching him about growing things from his earliest days. One afternoon in late April, unexpected visitors arrived: the circuit preacher and his wife, along with several families from the settlement. They came bearing gifts for the baby and news from the wider world. Marcus Crane, they reported, had left the territory in disgrace after his legal defeat, owing money to the railroad company that had backed his failed lawsuit. The company itself had found an alternative water source and was no longer interested in Ilara's rights. "Justice has a way of finding people," the preacher said with satisfaction. "Your stepfather's greed was his undoing." But more than sharing news, the visitors came to formally welcome the Montgomery family into the community. They had watched Ilara's courage in standing up to powerful interests, had heard about her transformation from auction block victim to confident homesteader, and they respected what she and Cale had built together. "We'd be honored if you'd consider joining us for church services when you can make the journey," the preacher said. "And if you ever need help with anything, you have neighbors now who'll stand with you." After the visitors left, Ilara stood on the porch holding Daniel, looking out at the valley that had become her home. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, sold, humiliated, stripped of everything, but from that lowest point, she had rebuilt herself into someone stronger, someone capable of fighting for her rights and her family. "What are you thinking about, Mama?" Kyle asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around both her and their son. "I'm thinking about belonging," Ilara said softly. "For so long, I didn't belong anywhere. I was too fat for society's standards, too much of a burden for my stepfather, too damaged for anyone to want. But here, with you, I finally belong. Not because I changed to fit someone else's expectations, but because you saw me as I was and decided I was exactly enough." "You were always more than enough," Cale said, kissing the top of her head. "The world was just too blind to see it. I'm grateful for that blindness, though, because it meant you ended up here with me." Daniel gurgled happily, reaching for his father's face with chubby fingers. Kyle took him, holding him up to see the valley spread below them. "This will all be yours someday, son," he said. "This land, this home, this life your mother and I built from nothing. and we'll teach you to see people the way we learned to see each other for who they are, not what they look like or what others think they should be. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, the Montgomery family stood together on their porch, looking out at their hard-won paradise. They had been forged in the fire of hardship and prejudice, had fought for every inch of the happiness they now possessed, and their love had proven stronger than judgment, stronger than greed, stronger than any force that tried to separate them. Elara thought once more of the girl on the auction block, exposed and ashamed, certain her life was ending. She wished she could tell that girl that she was standing at the beginning, not the end, that the man who would buy her for a single dollar would give her riches beyond measure, safety, love, family, and most precious of all, the knowledge that she had always been worthy, had always been enough, even when the world tried to convince her otherwise. The auction block was far behind them now, relegated to a painful memory that no longer had the power to hurt. In its place stood a life built on mutual respect, genuine love, and the unshakable certainty that they belonged together, belonged to this land, belonged to the future they would continue building together. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast mountain sky, Kyle and Elara carried their son inside to the warmth of the cabin they had made into a home. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying away the last echoes of old shame and old pain, leaving only the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Their story would live on in the settlement, told and retold the tale of the woman no one wanted and the mountain man who saw her true worth, who built a love strong enough to weather any storm, who proved that the measure of a person lies not in their appearance or their circumstances, but in their courage, their character, and their capacity to love and be loved in return. And in the quiet moments between work and rest, between the demands of daily life and the dreams of future days, Elara would sometimes touch the simple gold band on her finger, bought not with her stepfather's grudging money or the railroad's blood money, but with Kyle's hard-earned wages and freely given love, and she would remember. Remember where she had been, remember who she had become, and remember that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are merely the painful prelude to the best chapters of our story. Home was not just the cabin in the mountains, not just the land they tended or the valley they called their own. Home was Cale's steady presence and Daniel's sleepy weight against her shoulder. Home was knowing she was valued, respected, loved exactly as she was. Home was the life they had built together from the ashes of her old life, phoenix bright and impossibly precious. And as she finally drifted to sleep that night, Kyle's arm around her and their son sleeping safely in his cradle nearby, Elara smiled in the darkness. She had been bought for a single silver dollar and had gained everything that truly mattered. She had been stripped bare on an auction block and had found the strength to clothe herself in dignity and self-worth. She had been judged worthless by a cruel world and had proven them spectacularly, triumphantly wrong. The auction was over, the bidding was closed, and Elara Montgomery had won the greatest prize of all, not wealth or status or society's approval, but something far more valuable, a life lived on her own terms, with a partner who cherished her, in a home built on love and respect, and the unshakable foundation of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. The mountains stood eternal watch over their valley, and in the cabin below, the Montgomery family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had fought for their happiness and won, that they had built something beautiful and true, and that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, as they always had, as they always would.